7. Grave events. "To be perfectly frank, Doctor," Fulbright declared, "your story sounds utterly preposterous, and like something that over-imaginative French author Jules Verne might have invented." "This is beyond anything that Verne might have imagined," the doctor snapped. "Pass the kippers, please, Doyle." Doyle complied, helping himself to more bacon. He was enjoying breakfast after the activities of the previous night. For one thing, he was glad to be still alive. "I agree, Sir Edward," he offered as he munched. "It is a trifle difficult to accept, but—" "A trifle?" Fulbright gave a sharp bark. "It's completely impossible, man. Mermaids?" "Did I mention that word?" asked the doctor, annoyed. "I simply said that there was a humanoid sentient creature under the water last night. Plus, of course, the seal-like killers. I don't care what you want to call the creatures, but don't simply dismiss them out of hand." "After all, Sir Edward," Doyle added, "there's that poor boy-turned-hound in the shed out back. How difficult is it to accept a girl-turned-fish after that?" "I only have the assertions of the doctor and yourself that monster was once a boy," growled Fulbright. "And frankly, at the moment, I'd be inclined to doubt the pair of you if you told me the sun was going to rise again tomorrow morning." The doctor glared at him, then speared his kipper. "At least I know where we stand, then," he commented. "I take it that you are not willing to help me any longer." "I didn't say that," Fulbright protested. "But try and keep your requests rational." "Ah," said the doctor grimly, "I should have known it. Another rational man." He made it sound like a swear word. There came a gentle knock at the dining-room door, and one of the maids came in. "Begging your pardon, Sir Edward," she said meekly. "I have been given a message for the doctor." Fulbright grimaced. "Then deliver it, Nan, and stop cluttering up the room." She curtsied. "Miss Alice said to tell you that Miss Smith is awake and would like to see you at your convenience." The doctor grinned. "I see, Nan. And would those have been Miss Smith's words as well?" Nan coloured. Not precisely, sir." "I imagine not," the doctor commented cheerfully. He nudged Doyle. "Stop making such a pig of yourself, and let's go and see Sarah, shall we?" Doyle bolted the last of his bacon and took a quick swig of tea. "By all means," he agreed, patting his lips with the napkin. "If you'll excuse us, Sir Edward." Fulbright waved dismissively. Out, he growled. "I've got some thinking to do." "Very wise," the doctor approved. He strode out of the dining-room and followed Nan up the stairs to Sarah's room without pausing to check if Doyle was following. The maid tapped on the door, then opened it to let the men pass. Sarah was sitting up in bed, her hand bandaged and her face scowling. It was clear that she didn't want to be there. Alice sat at the bedside, a grim expression on her face. "Doctor," Sarah started, but Alice broke in. "Doctor, tell your friend that she must stay in bed and rest. She won't listen to me." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "And you think she listens to me either?" he asked. Then he smiled at Sarah. "Try and be a good patient, please, Sarah Jane." Waving her bandaged hand, Sarah snapped, "This is all that's wrong with me. It'll heal just as well out of bed as in it." She glared at Alice. "Are you going to get me my dress, or do I have to walk around the house in my nightgown?" Alice blushed, but didn't back down. "You're an immoral girl, Sarah." There was no way that Sarah could scowl after a remark like that. She collapsed laughing. "If you'd seen some of the gear I wear," she gasped, "you'd be certain of that." "Why don't we compromise?" suggested Doyle. "You stay in bed till lunchtime, then get up. But only if you promise to come back to bed if you don't feel well." Sighing, Sarah nodded. "Deal," she agreed. "Now, will the pair of you tell us what's going on out in the bay? I gave Alice the gist of what I know, and neither of us is very enlightened." "I think she must have cracked her head, Doctor," Alice explained. She claims that she was saved last night by a mermaid, and everyone knows that there are no such things." "Then everyone is wrong," the doctor replied, "because I caught a glimpse of one too." He looked vaguely puzzled. "I'm not sure how it was created, but there definitely are mermaids living at the bottom of your garden, so to speak." "Told you so," said Sarah smugly. She turned to the doctor. "Then what was it that attacked me?" "There are 2 different kinds of creature down there," he answered. "The young, well, let's call her a mermaid for now, for want of a better word, is one, and that other creature looked more like some mutant seal." "Obviously the creature that killed old Ben Tolliver," Doyle commented. "Yes," the doctor agreed. "Some kind of guardian, I'd venture to say. It is supposed to kill or scare off anyone who gets too close to the lights we saw." He slapped Doyle on the back. "But you killed one, and its companion took it away to prevent us from getting a good look at it." "But it's got to be related to that hound in the outhouse," Sarah commented. "Right?" "Yes," the doctor frowned. "It's certainly more than any seal born naturally on this world. The basic structure appeared to be a common grey seal, but it had been enhanced." Doyle nodded. "You think, then, that it was another constructed beast, like that hound? A child mutated somehow into a seal?" "Not exactly," the doctor answered. "I think it was the other way around. A seal that had human characteristics like enhanced intelligence grafted onto it." Sarah was almost ahead of him. "And that mermaid," she said slowly. "She was real, so she must have been a child merged somehow with a fish?" "Not a fish," the doctor argued. "More likely a dolphin or a porpoise. I only had a glimpse of the girl in poor light, but her tail was smooth, not scaled." He snapped his fingers. "Of course. Mammalian natures combined, just like the boy and the dog." Doyle nodded. "Something that occurs to me, Doctor," he offered, "is that the Hope has plenty of mammalian matter aboard it in the form of whale and seal products. Perhaps Captain Gray's business with Breckinridge had something to do with those, do you think?" "Right!" exclaimed Sarah. "And Breckinridge is fascinated with the sea. Maybe he's behind these mermaids." "It's quite possible," agreed the doctor, holding up a hand. "But this is mere supposition. We have no evidence linking him to the mermaids, do we?" "We could get it," said Sarah, "if we sneak into the factory and have a good look-see." "Oh, no," said Alice. "You are staying here, Sarah." She looked very crossly at the other woman. "I can't follow everything that you've been saying, but this is obviously quite dangerous. It is no task for a woman." The doctor grinned. "She's right that it's dangerous, Sarah. You rest up while Doyle and I check into it." He winked at her. "Maybe you could talk to Alice and explain a little about women's lib." "Darned right," Sarah growled. "If I have to stay here, I'm going to set her straight." "Women's lib?" asked Alice blankly. The doctor nudged Doyle. "Come on," he said. "Want to wager that by the time we return, Sarah will have turned the whole social order of the house upside down." "Good Lord!" exclaimed Doyle. "She's not one of these militant females, is she?" "Of course not," the doctor answered. "Nothing that mild." The doctor dismounted from the horse that Fulbright had loaned him before he reached Breckinridge's factory. Doyle, puzzled, reined in his own steed, but didn't dismount. "We've still got a half-mile or more to go, Doctor," he said. "Or were you planning a side trip?" "Not exactly," the doctor answered. "Just a thought that struck me." He pointed ahead of them at the ugly brick building. "That's Breckinridge's factory, right?" "Indeed." The doctor swung around about 45 degrees until he was pointing out to sea. "And that's the bay we were in last night, isn't it? I wonder if it's no more than coincidence that the factory overlooks the bay." He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I wonder if you can see the bay from the top floor of the factory. That's where Sarah said Breckenridge has his private retreat. Doyle shrugged. From the angle, I'd say it was quite likely. Why? Because Breckenridge should have been able to see the wheel of light from up there in that case. And yet he's never reported doing so. I wonder why. Perhaps he never works late, Doctor, suggested Doyle. He's a self-made man, the Doctor snapped. You never get to be one unless you're prepared to work long hours. I think Sarah's right, and that he's mixed up in this affair somehow. Doyle frowned. Perhaps he is. Hadn't we better move on and see if we can get in to talk to him? In a moment, the Doctor answered. I was rather hoping that the boy hiding behind that tree over there would come out and talk to us before we left. What? Doyle stared at the trees, but could see nothing to indicate they were other than alone. Are you sure there's somebody there? I'm sure. The Doctor gave a large grin. Billy, isn't it? There was a stir of movement, then a thin, ragged boy stepped out from the trees. His face held a look a little way between annoyance and awe. How did you know I was there? It's my business to know things, Billy, the Doctor replied evasively. How do you do? I'm the Doctor. I believe we have a mutual friend in Sarah Jane Smith. Doyle shook his head in amazement. Astounding, my dear Doctor. This was an opinion Billy evidently shared. He gave the Doctor a look of respect. Not many can spot me, mister. You be pretty clever. Thank you, Billy. Now, did you just come here to tell me how brilliant I am, or do you have some news for me? The boy scowled slightly. Yeah, well, for Miss Smith, really, but seeing she ain't here, I suppose I could tell you. Early this morning, just after daybreak, there were a big wagon made a delivery at the factory. That's hardly surprising, Doyle commented. They must get supplies there all the time. The Doctor shook his head. Not that early, he commented. The workers wouldn't have arrived, and it meant that the wagon must have been waiting nearby since yesterday to make a delivery at that time. It suggests they didn't want to be seen, doesn't it, Billy? It do, agreed Billy, smiling. And it weren't no supplies such as that factory needs. He scuffed the dirt with his foot. I can't read, so I don't know what were in them, but it were barrels of some sort. Excellent work, Billy, the Doctor said approvingly. I doubt it was just floor polish, eh? He took a shilling from his pocket and flipped it to the startled youth. Let me know if you hear or see anything further, will you? Then he grinned at Doyle. This makes a foray into the factory more pressing, don't you think? Billy winked and vanished into the woods again. Doyle sighed and shook his head. This is all very peculiar, he announced. I still don't comprehend it all. Nor do I yet, admitted the Doctor, springing back up into the saddle. But some of the answers at least must lie within the factory. Come on, and follow my lead when we get there. He urged on his steed, and Doyle fell in behind him as they cantered the rest of the way to the factory gates. As they approached, a rat-faced man jumped to his feet in the guard hut. Stay where you are, he cried. There's no admittance. The Doctor glared down at him from his horse. Are you out of your mind, man? He snapped. Didn't your master tell you to expect us? Rat-faced looked surly and annoyed. I wasn't told to expect anybody. Then someone has made a grave error, the Doctor replied haughtily. We are with Lord Shaftesbury's committee. We have had reports that children are employed at this site and are empowered to investigate and report on their working conditions. I am certain that Mr. Breckenridge was notified of our arrival. Now, let us in. The guard scowled. I wasn't told about no arrivals, he said sullenly. I can't let you in. By thunder, Doyle exclaimed, getting into the spirit of the masquerade. This is intolerable. I'll say it is, agreed the Doctor. Very well. We shall return with the local magistrate and a court order in 15 minutes. He glared at the guard. And the constable with a warrant for your arrest. Impeding an official inquiry is a serious charge. What's your name? Ratface went pale. Here, he protested weakly. There's no need for that. Then announce us to Mr. Breckenridge, snapped the Doctor. I can't, the guard answered. Before either visitor could protest, he added, Mr. Breckenridge isn't here at the moment. "Then who is in charge, man?" demanded the doctor. "The factory manager, Mr. Kinney," the guard replied. "Then we'll see him," the doctor said. "Go and get him." He leaned forward in the saddle. "Now." The guard bolted across the open yard. Doyle moved slightly closer. "Do you think this bluff will work?" he asked quietly. "All the better for Breckinridge not being around," the doctor assured him. "Flunkies are much easier to hoodwink than bosses. They're terrified of making mistakes that could get them fired later. Stay in character and ask pertinent questions about the welfare of the child workers." The guard came rushing back, with a harried-looking man in tow. The newcomer appeared flustered and embarrassed. "I'm Jack Kinney," he said, panting slightly. "I'm afraid Mr. Breckinridge said nothing about any inspection." "That's not my fault," the doctor snapped. "You'll have to do for now, I suppose. When will the owner be back?" "Later today, sir," Kinney answered, wringing his hands nervously together. "I'm not certain precisely when. If you'd care to return then—" "What?" Doyle thundered. "And allow you the opportunity to cover up all your scandalous practices? Do you think we're feeble-minded, man?" Kinney was practically wetting his trousers with fear. "I assure you there's nothing untoward happening here, and we have nothing to hide." "Then let us in," the doctor said coldly. "We are the ones who will determine the truth of that, not you." He dismounted and fished in his pocket. "Here, you blithering idiot, my credentials. Don't you think to ask to see them?" He handed over a card and a bundle of papers through the gap in the gate. Kinney took them as if they were booby-trapped. "Ah," he muttered, peering over the wad. "Dr. John Smith of Unit? I thought you said—" "That I work at the moment for Lord Shaftesbury," the doctor snapped. "I'm on loan as a specialist man. Can't you see that for yourself? How can you be in charge of a factory when you can't even read plain English?" Kinney, flustered, handed back the papers and card. "Well, I expect it's all in order," he agreed. To the guard, he said, "Let them in, Raintree." The guard, still scowling, unlocked the gate. The doctor led his horse inside, followed by Doyle. The guard then ostentatiously locked the gate behind them. "Now, what do you gentlemen need to see first?" "Where precisely are the children employed?" asked Doyle. "I must make a thorough inspection of their work area to ensure its compliance with all relevant legislation, you know." Quite," agreed Kinney, wiping his hands on his trouser legs. "Ah, over here. This way. He led his two difficult visitors on a whirlwind tour of the factory. Doyle, quite relishing his role, really entered into the spirit of it, asking pointed questions and jotting down the replies in a small notepad. At one point he borrowed a tape measure, made several arcane determinations, and scribbled down the results disapprovingly. Kinney was getting so agitated that he barely noticed that the doctor was examining areas that were not included in the tour. On the accounting floor, the doctor suddenly barked, "Where are the shipping logs? What chemicals do you use here? Are any of them endangering the health of the children?" Kinney, white and trembling, pointed to the relevant accounting tomes. The doctor scanned them and slammed them shut. "And what's upstairs from here?" he growled. "That's Mr. Breckinridge's personal offices," Kinney answered. "Do any children work up there?" asked Doyle. "None at all," Kinney exclaimed. "Nobody but Mr. Breckinridge works there." "We'd like to see it to be certain of that," snapped the doctor. "That's quite impossible," the manager replied, shaking. "Even I don't have a key to that floor. Only Mr. Breckinridge does." "And he's conveniently absent," growled Doyle. He made another mark in his book. "This does not bode well, you know." "I think in that case," the doctor announced haughtily, "that we've seen all we care to for the moment." He glared at Kinney. "But tell your employer that we shall return tomorrow morning and expect to be met by him personally and shown around." He leaned forward and said softly, "And if there is any sign of alterations upstairs, we shall bring down the full force of the law on his and your head. Do you understand me?" Kinney nodded until his head looked as if it would fall off. "Oh, definitely. There'll be absolutely no problem. I'm certain of that." "There had better not be," Doyle commented, closing his notepad with a snap and sliding it back into his pocket. "I would hate to have to report further infractions." Then he strode to the door, forcing Kinney to follow him. This allowed the doctor a few seconds to scan the other open accounting books before following them. As they left the factory and headed for the town, Doyle grinned at the doctor. "I was starting to rather enjoy the part," he confessed. "How did I do?" "Rather admirably," the doctor replied. "You distracted the poor chap perfectly, allowing me to make my own determinations." His eyes sparkled. "I am more convinced than ever that our missing friend Breckinridge is involved in this little business. Let's head along to the Pig and Thistle and grab a little lunch and liquid sustenance, and I'll tell you what I discovered." When they were suitably ensconced with a pint and a slice of pie, the doctor started in on the food and his explanations. Young Billy was quite correct in his suspicions. There are signs of a burdened cart having arrived and departed this morning. About a dozen drums were unloaded and taken into one of the storage sheds. "You could tell that from the marks in the dirt?" asked Doyle. "I saw no such drums in any of the sheds we examined." "They've been moved again already," the doctor answered. "But there was the unmistakable scent of formaldehyde in the second shed we were shown." "And what possible use could that have for manufacturing wire?" "None," the doctor said, grinning. "But it's marvellous at preserving tissues, isn't it? There is something going on at that factory, all right, and the shipping logs I examined don't have any entries concerning chemical deliveries." "Not entered yet, perhaps?" Doyle suggested, playing devil's advocate. "Not even a shipping bill," the doctor replied. "That delivery this morning didn't officially happen, which I find rather significant." "Then whatever answer there is to this mystery is to be found on the third floor?" asked Doyle eagerly. "No," the doctor finished his pie, then looked up thoughtfully. "Sarah's been shown that floor, and she didn't see anything significant. I suspect that the secrets are hidden below ground rather than above." "Below?" The doctor nodded. "I was quite intrigued by the chips and grooves cut into the stone floor beside one of the lathes that doesn't appear to have been operated recently." Doyle's eyes lit up. "Ah, you suspect a secret entrance to a cellar area." "I do indeed," the doctor grinned. "I think Mr. Breckinridge has a little more invested in the future of this village than he's let on to anyone." He glanced around the half-empty pub. "You know, this is rather a nice tavern, isn't it? I wonder if they have any rooms to let." Doyle frowned. "I imagine so. Whatever for?" "I'd like to stay in town this evening," the doctor replied. "It'll be easier to slip into the factory that way." Doyle laughed. "I like your manner of thinking, Doctor. I'm your man." "I rather thought I could rely on you to help." The doctor was abruptly serious. "We may well be walking into grave danger, you know. These people would appear to have already killed to cover up their secrets. Do you possess a revolver? And would you be willing to use it if the need arises?" "Yes and yes," Doyle answered eagerly. "I'm very keen to see this mystery through to the end." "Fine. Then you'd better settle matters with Captain Grey. I'll meet you back here at the stroke of midnight." The doctor stood up and sang, "Come friends who plough the sea, truce to navigation, take another station, let's vary piracy with a little burglary." With a grin he added, "Gilbert and Sullivan. Trust me, it'll be all the rage later this year." Doyle, puzzled, simply shook his head. "I don't know how I let you talk me into doing this," Alice said worriedly. "Stop complaining," Sarah answered as she saddled a horse. "I thought you'd agreed that you had to know the truth about matters." "Yes," agreed Alice, working on her own saddle. "But going off alone like this, it can be very dangerous, you know." "Look," said Sarah with a sigh, "you can't hide behind men all your life, you know. Sometimes you've got to step out and face life full in the face. Otherwise, what are you? A slave, a dish rag, or a wimp?" The doctor will be annoyed, Alice said, tightening the clinches. My father will be furious. Let them be. Sarah dismissed the problem. Look, if I'm right, we've got a good chance of getting a real lead on whoever's behind this whole plot. According to the doctor, old Ben Tolliver was buried yesterday. Constable Faversham guarded the cemetery last night, but he can't pull night duty twice in a row. He has to sleep sometime. And the villains that nabbed Mrs. Belliver's body took it on the second night last time. I bet that they'll try again tonight. All we have to do is follow them, then send for the authorities who'll catch the gang red-handed. That's why I need a bit of help. I can't watch the crooks and go for help at the same time. Her steed was ready, so she swung up into the saddle. I don't know that I'm up to this, Alice confessed. I'm frightened. You'd be daft if you weren't a bit scared. Sarah patted her hand encouragingly. Honest, it won't be as bad as you think. And you'll be surprised how fast you can get used to this sort of escapade. I'm sure you do it all the time, agreed Alice, clambering onto her mount slowly. You're awfully brave and I'm not. It's just a matter of getting used to it, Sarah assured her. Anything a man can do, a woman can do better. Believe me. I'm starting to regret that I ever listened to you, Alice commented. Sarah grinned. Yeah, I know. I often wish I didn't listen to me either. Let's get with the hi-ho silver routine, shall we? I'm afraid I don't understand you. Let's ride. Ross examined the factory through his eyeglasses and then frowned down at Abercrombie. Eating again? He chided. I'd ask where you got that sandwich, but I'm sure I probably don't want to hear the reply. Likely not, agreed his assistant, chomping down. It needs more bleeding chutney, mind you. Still, since I didn't pay for it, no sense in complaining. He nodded his head towards the object of his boss's scrutiny. How's things? Getting intriguing, admitted Ross. He stroked his chin thoughtfully. The doctor and his friends appear to have somehow survived their little expedition last night. He and that man Doyle have been in and out of the factory this morning, and I very much doubt that this will be their last planned excursion of the day. Me too, agreed Abercrombie, licking his fingers at the last drips of chutney. I had a few words with a barmaid named Jen. She says that the doctor rented a room at the Pig for tonight. For once, you seem to have been doing your job, Ross commented. So, it looks as if the doctor plans to make an unheralded visit to the factory this evening. I think we'd better be prepared to intercept him. Don't you? Abercrombie groaned. Have a heart, he complained. I needs me beauty sleep. Far be it from me to argue with that assessment of your looks, Ross answered with a hint of a smile. But you'll have to catch up on it later. Tonight there will be plenty of work for you to do. Bleedin' hell, muttered Abercrombie. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, as me mum used to say. Then it's a good thing your name isn't Jack, the Colonel said. It isn't, is it? You know it ain't. Then stop complaining and get a little rest now so you'll be fresher tonight. Abercrombie just scowled and tried to settle down. It was clear he wasn't at all keen on roughing it, but it was equally apparent that Ross didn't care. It was starting to get dark when Sarah and Alice arrived on the outskirts of Bodham. For the last 15 minutes of the ride, Alice had been absolutely silent. Sarah glanced at her companion, seeing that the girl's hands were absolutely white and that her pretty face was pinched and drawn. She started to feel guilty about what she'd put the girl through. It was hard for her to remember sometimes that not everyone was born brave. Listen, Alice, she said, reining in her mount. I think you'd better go back home. No, Sarah, the other girl answered. Her voice was strained, and she was trying to put a brave face on it. I promised to help you, and I will not back down now. Sarah nodded. I know, but I bullied you into it. Look, I think you've done more than I should have asked. It's much harder for you to go through this than it is for me. We've had very different upbringings. An idea struck her. Look, Ride back to the hall and make sure your father stays up for a few hours. Then tell him where I am and what I'm doing. If I read Sir Edward right, he'll insist on coming to my help with a rescue party. That way, if I get into trouble, he can help bail me out of it, can't he?" "You think that's a good idea?" asked Alice eagerly. Sarah could see that she was looking for an honourable way out of her dilemma. She really was terrified of spending the night in a cemetery, but she didn't want to let Sarah down. "I'm sure it is," she said gently. "But what if you need help?" "I'll get in touch with Billy, that boy I told you about," Sarah replied. "I'm sure one of the kids will be more than willing to bear messages for me. Someone will help me, I guarantee it." Alice hesitated, not wanting to look too eager to desert her friend. Then she nodded. "You can count on me," she vowed. "I'm sure I can." Sarah waved as Alice rode off. Then she sighed. "Someone will help me," she muttered to herself. "Great line." "Luckily for you," said a familiar voice, "someone is more than willing to help out a maiden in distress." "Lord," asked Sarah, her face turned towards the heavens, "what have I ever done to deserve this?" Then she glared down at Kipling, who had crept out of hiding behind a wall to grin lecherously up at her. "What happened to the other two stooges?" "McBee and Duns," Kipling laughed. "They were caught smoking behind the groundsman's sheds. They're in detention, silly buggers. But I'm here and eager to help." "Lucky me," said Sarah with a sigh. Well, she supposed it was her own fault. She had wanted to meet Kipling in the first place, hadn't she? And she could use someone to keep her awake and alert, and to run for help if need be. "OK, you can come along, but you'd better behave. That means no lewd comments, understand?" "Absolutely," assured Kipling. "The soul of honour, that's me." "Why do I find that so hard to believe?" asked Sarah, rolling her eyes. "Don't answer that, and follow me." She rode over to the Pig and Thistle, where she stabled her borrowed horse. Darkness was closing in on them now. Sarah took the dark lantern from her saddlebags and slipped it into one pocket of the jacket she wore. Then she led the way to the small graveyard. As she'd expected, there was no sign of the portly Faversham. The poor, overworked man was probably at home right now, snoring his head off. She could sympathise with him. He had to be utterly out of his depth with the strange occurrences that were going on. On the other hand, she was right in her element here. In the failing light, she examined the small burial mound. Tolliver had been buried near the entrance, in the poorer section of the cemetery. Several hundred yards further in, by one of the stone walls, there was a larger, more impressive monument, some kind of a mausoleum, she assumed. She could barely make out the signs of a stepwell. "Over there," she decided. "We'll be under cover, and we'll have a good view across at Tolliver's grave." She grinned at Kipling. "Not nervous, are you?" "Me?" Kipling laughed scornfully. "Not likely. But if you need a little comfort—" "I won't," Sarah assured him. "Trust me on that one." Alice was feeling terrible as she rode back from Bodham. Despite everything, she was certain that she'd let Sarah down. This mission to get her father to help out was, she was certain, merely a sop to bolster her up. Sarah was doing all of the work and taking all of the risks, and she had done nothing but— what was that strange word that Sarah employed? Wimp out? But she couldn't help herself. She was not by nature a brave person. The thought of spending the night in a graveyard, even with Sarah for company, terrified her. It was bad enough just thinking about being surrounded by mouldering corpses, but Sarah seemed to think there was a real chance of there being living people turning up, people that were desperate and despicable enough to rob the graves. She shuddered in horror at the idea. This was not what she was supposed to do with her life. Her father had never intended that she should be adventurous. And she knew that Roger would have been appalled if he'd known what she had almost done. Roger loved her. Of that she was certain, and he would always protect her. even if he did seem to be a little odd when on the subject of that friend of his. As if the thought of him had produced the reality, Edmund Ross stepped out suddenly into the road ahead of her, waving at her to stop. With a cry of shock, Alice reined in her steed. Ross marched over and grabbed the reins to prevent her from leaving. "A little late to be out riding, isn't it?" he asked pleasantly. "I'll do what I wish and when I wish it," Alice replied, with as much courage and contempt in her voice as she could muster. "I'll thank you to release those reins." Ross didn't remove his hands. "Alice," he said gently, "there's no need to be so angry with me." "Is there not?" she asked him coldly. "After what you did to me yesterday? Or is that of no consequence in your eyes?" "You can hardly blame me for that," Ross answered. "You were trying to go through my luggage. The drug was merely a sleeping draught I used to protect my cases when I travel abroad. You'd be surprised how many foreigners have tried to rob me." "I find that a feeble excuse," she snapped. "Then I'll try and invent a better one," Ross promised her. "Please, Alice, don't be so harsh in judging me. I assure you that I bear neither you nor anyone dear to you any malice, nor intend to cause any harm to them. But I have work to do, and that work must not suffer." "Work?" she asked scornfully. "Work that involves that thieving little friend of yours, no doubt." "Abercrombie, yes," admitted Ross. "I know he's not the most appealing person in the world, but he does have his good points." "Such as his skills at burglary?" suggested Alice, annoyed. Ross didn't bother to deny her accusations. "There are times when such skills do come in handy, yes." "At Fulbright Hall?" Ross scowled. "Alice, I resent the implication that I intend or intended to rob your family. Do you really think that little of me?" "I don't know what to think of you," she exclaimed, frustrated. "You evade simple questions, you sneak about my home, and you ask me to trust you. How much of a fool do you think I am?" "Obviously more of one than you may be," he answered, equally annoyed. "And not as great a fool as I am for thinking that you would accept anything I had to say." She glared down at him. "Then tell me what I want to know. What are you doing here, Edmund?" He shook his head. "I am not at liberty to tell anyone that right now. In a few days, perhaps, but not now. There's too much happening, and too many people involved." He sighed, and then looked up sharply. "When you passed me earlier, Miss Smith was with you. Where is she now?" "I don't see that that is any of your concern," she replied imperiously. "Let me pass." "She hasn't gone to the factory, has she?" he asked sharply. Annoyed by his tone, Alice glared at him. "I refuse to answer any more of your insufferably rude questions." Ross grimaced. "I take it that means our enterprising friend is engaged in something most likely foolhardy, and probably dangerous as well. Why won't any of you let well enough alone?" "Why won't you let me alone?" cried Alice. In sudden rage, she slapped at his hands. Startled, Ross allowed the reins to fall. Alice set her heels to her horse, and Ross barely had time to jump out of the way before the steed leapt past him and bore Alice away. Ross was still staring ruefully after the vanishing horse and rider when Abercrombie emerged from the woods, a wide smirk on his face. "Got away with women, haven't you?" he asked slyly. "Not one of my more useful traits, sadly," Ross replied. "Well, I think we may take it as read that Miss Smith has dealt herself a hand in this game. A pity. I was starting to like her. So what does this mean for us?" "It means that we'll be getting into the factory a trifle earlier than I had planned on." "Hey-ho," muttered Abercrombie. "More bleeding work for me, that's what it means." Sarah found it difficult restraining her temper with Kipling. Not that he was exactly misbehaving, but he was trying to get as close to impropriety as he could without getting her completely furious. Now he was getting on her nerves by complaining about the darkness. If we had a light, she hissed, then they'd be able to see us and wouldn't come, would they? I know that, Kipling agreed, but I resent being forced to act as a camping ground for so many dratted insects that can see me even in the night. Sarah was about to give him a sharp rejoinder when the nagging thought at the back of her mind finally crystallised. Light, she muttered, smacking herself on the forehead. That's it. That's what? Asked Kipling, puzzled. Last night I saw lights under the sea out there in the bay, explained Sarah. At the time, there was something that struck me as odd about them, but I couldn't place it. Now I have. What sort of lights will burn underwater? I shouldn't think any would, Kipling objected. The water would put them out, unless they were covered with globes to prevent the water reaching them. That's what I thought too, agreed Sarah. But wouldn't gas lights flicker? The ones I saw were quite even and steady, which suggests that they were electrical. Kipling frowned. I've heard about those devices, he said, but there's none around here, are there? Beckinridge has them installed in his factory, Sarah told him. Ah, Kipling caught on. So if there are lights under the bay, then they are most likely a part of his system. Right, agreed Sarah. Yet another probable connection between our friendly philanthrope and the mystery. Evidence is absolutely piling up, agreed Kipling. Why don't we just tell the police? Because it's all circumstantial, Sarah pointed out. There's nothing that definitely ties into anything, much less to a crime. Even if those lights are his, there's no crime in lighting up the seabed, is there? But, Kipling started to say. Sarah suddenly clapped her hand over his mouth. Shush, she hissed, and pointed through the darkness. There was a movement by the far wall of the graveyard, and the faintest of lights. It was sufficient to throw the strange shapes of decaying stones and figures into weird relief. Sarah shivered, partly from the cold. She wasn't superstitious, but after travelling with the doctor for a while, you could never assume that even a graveyard was as still and safe as it appeared to be. As they watched, a bulky figure slipped over the wall. The newcomer was carrying a dark lantern, slitted to allow only a tiny beam of light to escape. It sufficed to show his motion, but was not enough to allow Sarah to make out any details. Kipling grinned excitedly. "The grave robbers!" he mouthed silently, and she nodded. At this time of night, it certainly wasn't anyone taking a shortcut home through the graveyard on his way home from the pub. The intruder moved slowly around among the tombstones, clearly looking for Tolliver's grave. Sarah watched intently, waiting to see what he would do. There was little doubt in her mind that they would have a longish wait while this person unearthed the casket, but it was exciting to see that she had guessed correctly. Now they had a really good lead. All she had to do was follow him back to his base, she was certain it would be the factory, and then send Kipling to fetch help. The case would be sewn up, no thanks to the doctor for once. There was the faintest of sounds behind her. Belatedly, she remembered that the doctor had mentioned there being 2 grave robbers. As she turned, she caught a quick glimpse of a huge man towering over them. His upraised hands held a jar of some kind, which he threw down at their feet. As Sarah started to rise, thick fumes enveloped her. She gasped for breath as the fumes filled her lungs. She felt an icy chill, and then it was as if she were falling down an infinitely long tunnel into nothingness.